Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue on with our examination of ancient Germania, as the Romans would have called it. Now, before we go any further, I would simply like to do a little bit of housekeeping and just sort of clarify the geography of Germania. And to begin with, let me just start by saying that to begin examination of the topic, to begin looking at this, we have to remove the contemporary notion of Germany from our minds. Germany is a very recent social construct. Germany, as we know it, largely came together in 1871. And prior to that, Germany was always just a collection of territories. It was a geographic designation in Central Europe, but for this period, this Germania, it refers to Central Europe and Scandinavia. It extends into Poland, what is now Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. This was Germania in the Roman sense of the word. This was where the Germans lived, and it was not a world of urban centers or well manicured parks. It was home to a dense tangle of cold jungle forest, of cold forest, marshes and heaths in Scandinavia. As a matter of fact, in Scandinavia, the forest quite literally broke up the landscape. Scania, the southern extreme of Sweden, was literally an island separated from the rest of Sweden, separated from the rest of Scandinavia by this thick sea of forest, of cold jungle forest. And that description would be well true into the Viking Age and into the late Middle Ages. The Baltic Islands and Jutland were settled primarily because those were areas where the soil can be easily worked, where there weren't a lot of natural obstacles to farming and to settlement in this region. Now, and also a key fact to why those areas were settled was that they were connected to sea trade routes. So soil can be easily worked and key destinations on trade routes. Now, different tribes tried to occupy critical valleys along the river systems, like the Elbe and the Vistula and the Oder and the Weser and all of the other great river systems in Germany. And these river systems, they served as lines of communication from the North Sea to the Danube. And they could also be further extended to serve as communication links down to the Black Sea region as well. Now, large sections of Central Europe were underpopulated or not populated at all. And Caesar went on to note, and this is Julius Caesar in his remarks, he went on to note that the Marciana Silva, or the Schwarzwald or Black Forest, extended from the lower Rhine across modern southern Germany, cutting off the lower Danube valleys, the Celtic zones, from the Germanic zones in the north. This forest served as great a barrier as any ocean. It was a thick area that was really hard to get maneuver through. Now, further archaeology, our archaeological evidence shows that the settlements of the Germans were limited to villages and hamlets. The Germans of this period never adopted urbanism, unlike the Celts, who adopted towns due to their contact with the Romans and the Greeks. In many areas in the core Germanic lands, urbanism did not develop until fairly late in the Middle Ages. Urbanism then really hinged on the introduction of the farm plow, and of course the three-field system and the manorial arrangements, along with the clearing of those forests to get the food production level up to the point that it could support cities in northern and central Europe. And that was a great accomplishment of itself, but that's an accomplishment of the Middle Ages, and something that we will get to at a later date. Now, the lack of cities help to explain some of the peculiarities of Germanic warfare. The Germans, for one, they excel as individual warriors. at setting ambushes in forests. And their forest ambush is best exemplified by the Bavarian disaster. But the Germans, they fail at fighting open battles in fields. Until the Roman army deteriorates to a level that is very much comparable to the German skill set. And that doesn't occur until quite late in the 4th and the 5th centuries. The Germans also never really learned how to capture cities. They never got the hang of siege warfare, which is understandable since they never built cities of their own. If you never learned to build a city, then you obviously would never be able to take a city. You wouldn't have that in your skill set. Now, we get reports from Romans and later of later Germanic armies invading Roman provinces and terrorizing the provincials and reaching cities. They reach the cities, but they cannot take the cities. They could not intimidate the forces behind the city wall into giving in to their demands. They could not use subterfuge to gain access to the cities as well. So they simply gathered, and this is one event, in which the Germans simply scour the surrounding area, the outlying fields of a city, gathering a great quantity of stones, and then they simply threw the stones at the men manning the walls. Now the men on the walls simply raised their shields, and the stones bounced off of their shields. And the Germans, and in this particular instance, the Germans were Goths. The Goths simply went away. They simply went back home. Because they could not because they could not take the city, they were at a loss of what to do, so they simply retreated home. Now, the Germans also attempted at various times to build siege machines. Their efforts really resembled huge carts, and they simply wheeled these carts up to the walls, and they would simply try to batter in doors, the gates of a city. Now, they knew that once they approached the walls, they would be greeted by arrows and boiling oil and all those other sort of nasty defensive features that cities would have. Now, the siege machine that they built was designed with their defense in mind. It was designed to protect them from these attacks. Now, once the Germans made it to the wall, the warriors who were manning this siege machine, they were at a loss as to what to do next. They did not have the materials or the tools to really chip away at the stone edifice of the wall, and they did not have the technology or the capability to batter down the gates of the city wall. What the city that they were attempting to attack eventually did was they simply rolled a large stone onto the German siege machine, killing the men inside. And again, the Goths, dejected, went away. They returned home. The siege capabilities of the Germans do not improve much after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Germans do not assimilate with the Roman world. The Germans, they later on assimilate, but at this period, they don't assimilate. Later on, after the fall of the Western Empire, they of course assimilate into this Roman identity, and they lose their German identity. Now, the German tribes of this time never gained any sense of being a distinct nation. They have far less of a sense of unity than the Celts. The Celts were able to unify in the wake of Caesar's campaign and Vercingetorix. The Germanic tribes, their ties were very loose. They were constantly on the move, so there was not a great sense of ties of any sort of cultural or political or ethnic tie to a particular region. Most of their important ties were kin-based. The tribes were constantly at odds with one another over the limited resources and the arable lands of their region. There were also no priestly castes like the Celtic Druids among the Germans. And Caesar reported that the Germans, that they had no images of their gods. And that has been checked by findings that illustrate that there were depictions of Germanic gods during the early Bronze Age. Cornelius Tacitus reports that the Germans worshipped Mercury, Mars, and Jupiter. Mercury receiving human sacrifices, and we can't be definitive, but we think that Tacitus associated Mercury with Odin or Woden, Mars with Tyr, and Jupiter with Thor. Tacitus also reported that the tribes living on the Judas Peninsula, that these tribes congregate around their mother goddess called Nerthus to declare peace, and that this goddess was a fertility god, and that this god really correlates with the Germanic god associated with fertility, like goddesses associated with fertility, like the Veneer. Now, Tacitus also reported that on the casting of runes and on the sacrifice of booty after a battle between the Hermunduri and the Chatii, the Hermunduri win, and so they dedicate the defeated by sacrificing them. Now we know that the Roman prisoners were sacrificed after the Varian disaster. That prisoners were put in wicked baskets and they were burned. Some were hung. The hanging sacrifices were the dedication to Odin. We know that. And Odin was a god of war. He was a god of wisdom and of runes and, of course, war. There is also a report from Tacitus that only Odin/Mercury receives human sacrifices, that the other gods do not. There is a very long continuity in the belief that of those gods in Germanic history, and that these gods would, there's a very long continuity and belief in these gods in Germanic history, and then that later on in the Scandinavian period and in the Viking period, these gods would undergo a sort of revival. And that their revival really precipitates the Viking assaults that we'll get to at a later lecture. Now, there is the presence of a distinct language, social custom for the Germanic tribes, but again, no understanding of a national or a larger ethnic identity among the Germans. Not like how we were seeing the Celts drift to. They're very much similar to the Greeks. Except for the fact that the Greeks were able to all pull together for common defense, but they were very much interested in just maintaining their own freedom and their own autonomy. Now, they very much cherished this separate and distinct tribal identity, and they were known to form limited coalitions to bring down or to temper the power of a larger tribe. Now, Tacitus also reports on the defeat of the Brutarii by a number of their smaller neighbors, and the competition among tribes would later will become the later Roman mechanism for control in Germania after they halt their imperial expansion. They incite intertribal wars to distract and to weaken German tribes. The Germans were prized as fighters, and they were hired as mercenaries. And the Romans, later Roman armies would adopt a number of practices from the Germans. Chief amongst them would be the Barbatus. And the Barbatus was the Germanic war cry. And later Roman armies will go into battle raising the Germanic war cry, raising the Barbatus. The Romans adopt the practice of raising the emperors on the shield. Early Germans would raise an elected leader, a petty king, a war chief, tribal chiefs on their shields in a public acclamation, and this practice will be transmitted to the later Christian kings of medieval Europe from these early Germanic tribes. Now, the Germans were described by both Caesar and Tacitus as having very limited political structure. Most resolutions were made in tribal meetings. These assemblies have been compared to the later things of the Middle Ages, and even the precursor to the more well-known German diets. These meetings were an assembly of the community's warriors who had gathered to make judgments, and they handled the issue pertaining to law, economics, peace, and war. Whenever a king needed to be elected, they would also meet. Now, the Germans do not progress into more structured political organizations until after sustained contact with the Romans. The nucleus of Germanic society was the family. Another social group in early Germanic society was the armed retinues of a charismatic war leader. This local warlord or chieftain would expect these armed retinue members to serve him, and these armed retinues were the nucleus of a German tribal army. These men were not professional soldiers, but fighters who attached themselves to a local elite. They gave this person their loyalty in return for rewards and spoils. Now, this tradition, this grouping, this transcended familial and tribal ties. Now, between 50 BCE, when Caesar conquered Gaul, and 16 BCE, when Caesar Augustus organizes the Gallic provinces to launch future offensive into Central Europe to bring all of the tribal regions under Roman control, the landscape of Central Europe, had changed. Many of the areas that had been Celtic were now partially Celtic or now completely German. The Germans had moved in, they had intermarried, and they had assimilated with the Celts on the other side. We know of this happening in what is now Bohemia. The conquest of Gaul by Caesar had tipped the balance in Central Europe in favor of the Germans, who had been coming down the rivers and really just taking over Central Europe. When Caesar Augustus launches his new campaign, he thought that he would encounter pushovers who were easily who could be easily removed and allow him to expand. What he found was a group that would check his advances and lead him ultimately to permanently fix his imperial boundaries. Now that we've discussed the Germans and the Celts, I'd like to sort of refocus our energies and go back to our grand narrative on the Roman Empire. And where we last left off in our narrative on the Roman Empire was in the year 211 of the Common Era, with the death of Emperor Septimius Severus. Now, the next century of Roman history will be a very dramatic episode, full of instances of political, social, and economic crises. The empire will nearly be undone, but then rather miraculously rebound to undergo a very surprising transformation to become a Christian empire. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire entered into a troubling time where there were where there was political instability, and a number of emperors during the second century simply coming in and coming out. The imperial office became a sort of revolving door. There were only about half a dozen emperors during the 2nd century. During the 3rd century, there were over 26 emperors, and I don't even have like a full list, a full count of the usurpers who attempted to gain imperial power. This period was marked by soldier emperors. And again, the soldier emperors, the only qualification they needed was the backing of an army. Things were so bad that Roman historians labeled this period the crisis of the 3rd century. There are 3 main factors that really contributed to this crisis, of the 3rd century crisis. First was this was an era of near constant civil wars in the Roman world. Most of the Roman legions had been stationed in a handful of provinces, most of which were on the imperial borders, in places like the Rhine and the Danube. There were also Roman legions stationed in Syria, and they were stationed in Syria to protect the eastern boundaries, the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. It was not long before the commanders of these armies realized that they were in command of large portions of the Roman military forces. This led the commanders to bribe their soldiers and to declare themselves emperors whenever an emperor died. Now, since each group would declare an emperor, a vicious three-way civil war would erupt, as all the claimants converged on one another to fight for primacy. Second, there were a number of dangerous barbarian invasions during this period. Outside of the imperial borders, the Germans were confederating into larger tribal groupings. The new tribal confederation did so to protect themselves from Roman incursions, and other Germanic groups they did so to protect themselves from larger Germanic tribes, and they also did so to protect themselves from being picked on by Roman armies whenever the Romans invaded Germania proper. Now, once they confederated, the Germans turned their eye towards the rich provinces of the Roman Empire. Typically, the frontier legions would be standing guard to protect the provinces from Germanic attacks, but due to the constant civil wars and the intrigue, the legions were absent, leaving the Germans free to invade and to plunder. Now, the third reason for the crisis was there was an economic collapse, which resulted from the political instability and the constant invasion. Cities were plundered, villages were destroyed, crops were destroyed, and people were killed. Merchants and traders, they were reluctant to venture out. Bandits and pirates proliferated, bandits on the road, pirates on the seas. They proliferated and they targeted whoever they wanted. All of these factors came together to create a perfect storm that wrecked the Roman economy. Whenever one of the claimants succeeded and became the new emperor, he immediately had to raise taxes, and he raised them on taxes and merchants, the two groups who could not afford any new taxes. And he did so to repair the armies and to meet the cost of government. Now, desperate for more income, Roman emperors started to debase Roman coinage. They added less and less valuable metals to their coins, while keeping the face value of the coins the same. Now, merchants and traders, they were not fooled. Merchants and traders, they were not fooled by this move. They rightly saw what the Roman emperors were doing. They called them out and they raised their prices accordingly, because they could not trust the coinage. And this led to just rapid inflation in the Roman world. The technological limitations on communication that I spoke of earlier, that also began to catch up with the Romans. It took a lot of time to transmit messages to the provinces under good conditions. When the empire was under was functioning properly, it took a great deal of time just to transmit simple messages. When the empire was under stress, communication broke down almost instantly. Now, by the middle of the 3rd century, it looked like the end was on hand for the Roman Empire. There were constant civil wars, the economy was a mess, and barbarians were roaming the provinces, plundering and causing terror. Now, as things looked their bleakest, a series of tough military emperors arrived on the scene. These men stabilized the Roman Empire, and interestingly enough, one of the main causes of the third century was army commanders fighting for primacy, and these army officers, they often provided once they proved that they were capable of defeating their enemies, they often provided the stability needed to order the Roman provinces, and of course they would have the military training and the military tactics to defeat the barbarians and to secure their imperial borders. Now, these soldier emperors also realized that the previous strategy used to check German incursions were outdated. Those previous methods were outdated and they needed to be replaced. One of these emperors, Aurelian, defeated several major Germanic threats, restoring order to the provinces, and he ordered a wall built around Rome, the city. The order by Aurelian to build the wall was a radical change in the outlook of the Romans. Rome had not had walls since the days of the Republic. The Aurelian wall represents, on the one hand, an admission of declining Roman power and the pragmatism of Aurelian, who rather than ignore the problem, put in place a practical solution to meet these new threats. Now, the last of these soldier emperors was a man named Diocletian. Diocletian had the longest reign of any soldier emperor. He enacted a number of key reforms. He defeated the Germans on the borders. He secured the provinces, but also reorganized the Roman army. The Roman army under Diocletian numbered somewhere around 500 to 600,000 men. Many of these new recruits were from the bellicose tribes that were threatening the Roman world. Diocletian turned a Roman problem into a Roman solution. Diocletian had reoriented the Roman frontier armies from a thin force spread around the borders into a centralized force that was capable of projecting beyond the frontier to meet any threat that had emerged. Diocletian also reformed provincial administration, separating military command from the provincial governors. Now, the provincial military commanders were no longer short-term governors, but were now career military men with years of military experience. Provincial governors were now exclusively civil administrators rather than military and civilian leaders. That understanding that had been in place for centuries was now radically reformed, radically altered, changed, or really eliminated. That job description was eliminated under Diocletian. To increase the efficiency of provincial administrators, Diocletian subdivided the provinces into smaller administrative districts. These new subdivisions allowed each provincial governor to address the concerns of a given region more vigorously, with the governors focusing on the local matters. There was a need to appoint an overall imperial administrator for large blocks of provinces. To fill the gap, Diocletian created a new administrative district called a diocese. Now, each diocese had an overall administrator called a vicar, and both of these terms, the administrative district and the administrative official, they would both be adopted by Christianity. Now, the legions were consolidated into multi-legion armies, and the new armies were commanded by an overall commander. This overall commander would be called a dux, and dux became the root of the word duke. Diocletian also reformed the imperial governing system. He split the empire into 4 and appointed a co-emperor for each subdivision. This system that we know had a tetrarchy, really sort of what was put in place to underscore the need to adequately meet the empire's needs using radical innovations, radical and pragmatic innovations. Collectively, these reforms, the reforms of Diocletian's, they are all examples of Diocletian taking Roman problems and turning them into the problems themselves into solutions. Collectively, these reforms created more attention to detail at the local level while creating more coordination and strategy at the broadest level possible. Now, with that being said, we'll break here. We'll come back and we'll take a more in-depth look at Diocletian's reforms and the impact Diocletian reforms had on the Roman world. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. As always, I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.